So yeah, so we're going to talk about row-level security. I imagine there's probably a lot of people in the room who are familiar already with the basic concept of it. Gabrielle stole like all my thunder, but yeah, that's me. That's my little about slide. Yeah, did that stuff. So what is RLS, right? So RLS is this idea. It's a couple different databases have different ways of phrasing it or different kinds of support for it. But the general idea is that it allows you to provide an individualized view for each user in the system, right? Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be based on users, or it doesn't have to be based on connections. It can be based on more or less anything that you want. But this is the general idea, right? So the whole point is that we're going to be able to do filtering of the records that are being returned from your select queries, as well as filtering on what records are visible to commands like update or insert or, well, update or delete, right? Insert is only adding records. So what we've implemented with Postgres, or what I've been working to implement with Postgres that I'll be going over, is something where you can have it based on roles if you want. That's kind of a convenience. But as I said, you could apply a given expression to everything and then just filter on whatever you want. One of the other real big important pieces about this is that we want to make sure that policies are always applied, right? Whenever you go and enable row-level security, because the whole point about it, this is a security mechanism. That's also why there's a default deny approach for row-level security. And I think that's common amongst row-level security implementations and other databases as well. So let's talk a little bit first about how you got away with, how you managed to make this work prior to actual row-level security, right? So if you don't have row-level security in your database, what you tend to end up doing are creating these views, right? So Postgres has the capability to have views, of course, created that then are dependent on the current user, perhaps. The trick with that, though, is that up until, well, it's been a couple of years now, but for a long time in Postgres, we didn't have what's called security barrier views. And what this meant was that even if you created a view, if the user was able to create some function, they could encourage the optimizer or the planner to push that function down prior to the conditionals that are defined in the where clause of the view, meaning that somebody could potentially get access to those records even though they're not supposed to see them. So we do now have security barrier views, which is an option that you add on top of the view to say, okay, you have to basically implement the quals in the view definition first, right? That's how Postgres treats it. So we had that capability, and that was part of what allowed us to more easily add on row-level security. Some of the interesting points, kind of down points about using the view-based approach is that now you've got another set of objects in the database, potentially one for every existing table that you have in the database if you want to do that kind of filtering for every table in your database. So now you've got all of these things mirrored. And oh, by the way, you have to manage all of the permissions that are applied to those independently of the actual tables underneath. And just in general, it becomes a hassle, right? It's just not very conducive. Now, one thing that we did add recently also was this with check option. So we had security barrier views. That was great, right? Then in 9.4, which will be coming out soon, we added the ability to have security barrier views be updatable, right? As long as they're simple enough. So what that means is that you can actually run an update or an insert or delete query against a relatively simple definition for a view. And now you don't have to worry about also having to do something else, create rules or what have you on top of a view to cause those to happen, right? That's one of the other problems that we have with views is that if the view was, you wanted it to be updatable, you had to actually go through and create these rules, especially with security barrier options, right? So in 9.4 actually changes that. So 9.4 we have the ability to say, with security barrier and with check option, and what that does is basically it says, okay, the view security barrier, I can update it because it's a simple view, and when I do update it, any new records that are being added through that view, right, with the with check option, must be visible. Okay? So that's how the with check option works, which is actually part of standard SQL. So that's something that hopefully people are pretty familiar with. what that basically prevents is people from being able to add records that they are not able to see. Okay, it's a way of controlling the policy. It's not that great though, because it means it works for with check, and with check option, it works for things that are visible, but you may want to have cases where you're able to, say insert records that you can't see in some cases. So today you'd have to do that, even with 9.4, you'd have to go through and do some, have some other mechanism, have a rule or whatnot in place over top of that view in order for that to be able to work. That then runs, some other query or some other function to implement it. So it's not ideal, okay? I mean, there's upsides and downsides to it. Cascaded versus local is basically talking about how many, if you've got a bunch of different levels of views, whether the with check option gets cascaded down through all of them or not. So you can have a case where one view is over top of another view, and if you want, you don't have to specify the with check option for all of the views involved. You can say cascaded for the one at the top if you want it to actually then flow through all the views that exist. So feel free to interrupt me, ask questions, or stop and whatnot. I'm going to keep going, but I'm happy to take questions as we go, and we'll also hopefully have time at the end to take questions. So another approach that people have used in the past for doing this kind of, yes, Bruce?
I'm sorry, when you had the check option and you were talking about cases where you want to maybe not, you maybe bypass that, you're basically saying you create the view, you put the check option on it, but then there's some case where you want to bypass that check option and then you'd have to use rules to do that? Is that what you're saying?
Right, yeah. So if you wanted to, so the with check option only works with the filters that are defined in the view.
Okay.
Right, so the view has one set of filters that are applied, okay? And that set of filters are applied both on querying out of the view and when you enable the with check option for new records being added through the view, okay? If you wanted to have two distinct policies for those two different operations, like a policy for what's visible through select and a different policy for what's allowed to be added to the table, you have to do something else. Like you can't just do that directly with the security barrier views.
But I thought check option only really applied to the insert part. Does it apply to the?
Well, it would apply to updates too.
Yeah, but you said you'd want a separate one for viewing.
Right.
But I thought check only worked on writing.
It does. That's
So
correct.
why would
But
you need a separate policy? Oh, you want a different
I want a different policy.
policy. Okay.
Exactly. I want to be able to insert stuff that's hidden from me. Or maybe I want to not allow inserting certain records.
If you wanted to insert stuff that was hidden from you, you just wouldn't use the check option.
That's one option, right? That's one thing that you could do. But what if I want to allow inserts, using a different criteria?
Different, but you can't.
Right. You can't do that with this, right?
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Does the with check option prevent you? Yes. Well, no. With check option doesn't apply in the delete case really, right? Because what with check is about is whether whatever ends up in the view is something that you can see. With this, you can't delete stuff that you can't see, right? So that's just part of the regular, right? So if you wanted a policy that was different from the visibility policy for deletes, that's not something that you can support with simple updatable views, right? You can't, because you can only delete things that you can see with this. Actually, that's going to be true regardless. You can only delete things you can see. Now that I think about it, I don't think that's going to change. It doesn't change with the row-level security implementation that we've been working towards. But but you can have a distinct policy for deletes versus a distinct policy for selects. So it's only going to allow you to delete things that pass that policy. So we'll get to how it works with security barrier policy or with row-level policies shortly. But yeah, that's how it works with the with check option. Is there another? Yeah.
Yeah, so is that for those type of tables, yes, do you have a specific user column, or we just have a specific, some certain column to define the user?
Right. You would need to have, so if you wanted to have row level security based on the user, you'd have to have a user column in the table in order to be able to provide that filtering. That's correct, yeah. Okay? All right, moving on. So another approach that's been used in the past is this kind of multi-schema approach, where essentially every user gets their own set of tables. I've seen this a lot, and it is extremely painful because once you get up into the hundreds, thousands of tens of thousands of users, I'm not even sure. I mean, it gets ridiculous how large the Postgres catalogs get. You have all these tables all over the place, and then if you actually want to bring them all back together, it's a huge pain, right? You have to create some kind of view or make them all part of an inheritance system. And by the way, you still then have to manage the permissions across all of these different sets of tables all over the place and keep them all consistent. But there's so many of them that you have to do like rolling changes and whatnot. So it gets to be a real hassle. But that's definitely something that I've seen happen a lot. Another issue is that you may have to use dynamic SQL to make sure you get the right schema for that user that's logged in. You can use search path, that may work, but it depends on exactly what you're doing. So there's a lot of challenges to doing that with the multi-schema approach, right? So that's kind of the introduction to row-level security and how it's kind of existed in Postgres up to this point, right? So moving on to what we're implementing and what I'm really hoping to get into, and I'm basically putting in the 9.5, is this ability to actually have row-level security in Postgres as its own kind of top-level capability, without having to go through and use views, without having a separate object that you have to maintain the permissions on like you would with a view, without having to have these separate sets of tables, right? So the first big point I want to bring up about this is that with the implementation that we're adding right now is you have to say alter table, enable row-level security. I'm going to hit on this again because I'll be honest, it's something that's tripped me up before while working on this when we added this change, because the idea is that you want to be able to have policies defined for a table that maybe are not being turned on yet, or maybe you'll turn them on later. The other nice thing about this is that because we have this kind of notion of a default deny policy, when you turn on row-level security for the table, if there aren't any policies for that table yet, you're not going to be able to see anything, right? So that's how a default deny policy works, right? Unless you're specifically allowed to, you can't see anything, right? So one approach when you're setting up your schema might be to turn it on for all of your tables and then go through one by one and make sure that you are creating the correct set of policies for each table. So I'm going to talk about actual policies in a minute, but I wanted to hit on this really hard because it's really important to remember that you're going to have to enable RLS at the table level. One of the other points is that all policies that are implemented through this system are, basically they're exempt for the owner of the table and the super user, because the super user is kind of considered the owner of everything, or at least has that level of access. So what we do is we don't include RLS for those cases. So when you're querying against a table that you own, you won't see it by default. I'll go in just a minute how to actually get around that. So one of the other points is that disabling the policy or disabling row-level security does not remove any existing policies on the table. So we also are adding a new GUC, right? This is set row security. And what this allows you to do is you either turn it on or off or force, okay? So on is kind of normal operation, right? On means that you get whatever policies you get. Table owners and super users are excluded for queries that they're running against the tables that they own. And everything's kind of normal, right? Off means don't ever apply any RLS period, right? Now this can be set in your PostgreSQL.conf, so if you're kind of paranoid, you can go set it in there, and row-level security won't be enabled at all. What will happen is that when you do run a query that wants to do RLS, or realizes that that table has RLS on it, what will happen is that it'll just throw an error and say, sorry, you don't have permission to query against this table with row security turned off. Right, so that's that way you're not actually leaking information through by just being able. If anybody can just turn it off, then you'd be able to just get around the fact that row-level security exists on the table, and that wouldn't be good. The force option basically says, okay, I'm gonna, maybe I want to test something even though I'm the table owner. I want to test that my policies are working, right? So that's where you can use set row security to force, and that means that row security will be applied even for super users and table owners, but it's got to explicitly be set. Right? It won't be set by default. Now, you could probably put in your PostgreSQL.conf row security equals force, and it would work. For everybody who's then logged in, even table owners would have row-level security applied. But that's not something that's going to prevent table owners from being able to get access to the data in the table if they really wanted to. So I'm not sure that it's necessary or particularly helpful, but it's something to consider. So here's kind of that basic initial command, right? This is the big one. This is the create policy command. It's a new top-level command, right? There's 3 of them that I'll be talking about: create, alter, and drop. The create top-level command basically allows you to define a new policy. So when you create policies, you name them. You give them whatever name you want. Those names are, policies are always attached to tables, and so the name has to be unique against that table that it's applied to, but you can use the same policy name for different tables if you want, which I find actually really handy, because what that's going to allow you to do is, maybe the policy has some meaning, the name of the policy has some meaning to you as you're developing it. It's some kind of rule set that's being applied, but that rule set may have to be slightly different because of different column names or because of other information. Maybe there's joins that have to happen, or queries that have to go against other tables in the system for some of the tables that are being, have row-level security. So I find it really helpful that we have a way to specify the same policy name, for different tables. Of course, you can't have the same policy name for 2 different policies on the same table. Some of the other really interesting, interesting bits about this is that you can have policies that are applied for specific commands. So this is what allows you to have a policy for delete that's different from a policy for select, for example, right? A select policy is only used when you're running select queries, while a delete policy would be used when you're actually doing deletes. And those could have different expressions, right? So what you'll see here is that the, create policy name on table, right? That's what we talked about. And then there's the different command types that are available. We also have the ability to specify it for specific roles. Now, you don't necessarily have to have this capability to make this work, but if you didn't, things could get pretty complicated, or you'd have to write a function underneath, because maybe, for these roles you want this policy, for those roles you want this other policy. It gets kind of hairy and complicated. So what we have is an ability to specify it per role. By default, it goes to public, right? Which basically means everybody, okay? So by default, when you create a policy, it's going to be applied for everyone querying against the table. And then there's these 2 expressions down here. The 2 expressions that we have are a using expression and a with check expression. The using expression is what's going to be applied for basically everything at the end of the day, except in cases where you want to have something different for with check. So during the development of this, we initially only had the using clause, but then we realized that people might want to be able to have 2 different clauses for these 2 different distinct things, right? And that's particularly useful for updates, right? You may want to be able to update something that you then can't see, right? These kind of things are something that, that's something that you couldn't do through your normal tables, normal with check options and whatnot. So what we do here is that when you do have a using clause defined, if you don't define a with check clause, we're going to use that using clause as well for both by default. So if you'd only use the with check if you want it to be different from the using clause in some way. So it makes things a little bit easier for when you're actually creating things. You don't have to specify both all the time. Yes, sir?
I just want to confirm that I'm understanding using controls what you can read, with check controls what you can write.
Right, that's correct. So with check is all about what rows are actually being added back into the relation. That's correct. Any other questions? Yeah?
Can you apply a policy to a view?
No, you can't. No, policies cannot be applied to views currently. It's kind of an interesting idea. I hadn't really thought about it, but might be a capability we could add if there's a use case there. Why wouldn't you just put the expression into the view? Or build the view over top of a table that had the... Okay. I mean, if there's a use case for it, we can certainly look at it, but no. Currently, policies are only applied to tables. Yes?
Can you specify different fields for the select clause? If you have a policy on selects, can you specify columns?
Yeah, you can use whatever columns that exist in the table. This expression is essentially any where conditional, anything that returns a Boolean. So it can be, however many different, you can reference whatever columns you want. You can call functions. You can do select, subqueries to other tables. more or less whatever you want. There are a few limitations in terms of what exactly you can put in there. I believe we prevent things like aggregates. You can't use inside of that. You can't use CTEs. There's some things you can't do inside of that expression, but in general, it's whatever you can put in the where clause. Any other? Yeah, certainly you could do a subselect, absolutely. Yes, in the back? No, this works with the grant system. So a user would have to have select rights on the table as well, right? And then, so they first have to be able to query the table at all. Once they can query the table, then yeah, the policies would be applied to what actually gets returned, or what they're allowed to see through that policy on the table. Yes, Kevin?
I don't have an opinion on this. I'm just curious, can these be applied to materialized views?
Not today, no. But it's a fair question again. It might be something that we could look at, but today, no, you can't apply them to materialized views. Any other questions? Yes, Bruce?
Are you allowing like nonsensical options like select and with check?
Am I allowing nonsensical options? Okay, no. So if you try to do, so the question was, if you wanted to create a policy, if you create a policy for select, the command, and used with check, what would happen? And today we'll turn an error. It'll error back saying, no, you can't do that. It doesn't make any sense. The only case where you can actually do both, there's two cases where you can do both using and with check, and that's for all and for update. That's it, okay? So for insert, you can only use with check, right? For select, you can only use using, and then for delete, you can only use using, right? Because delete is about kind of what's visible to you. You're not adding any records to the table, so with check doesn't make sense. With check only makes sense when new records are being added to the relation. Does that make sense to everybody?
So you need separate policies. Say you want the example of being able to write something you can't read. You need two separate policies.
No, you could use the all you could use all and have, and pass in both using and with check with whatever expressions you want. So that case would work with all. But I mean, you can, right? Which is a really neat capability. You can have it per command if you want. Any other questions on that? Yes.
What would happen if you created a policy using all and then created another policy using delete?
So, very good point. I thought I had covered it, but I guess I didn't. When there are multiple policies that have been discovered that are going to be applied, this applies to role membership as well. So when I say role name here, that's for anybody who is a member of that role, right? So that proper normal role membership rules apply. Okay, and the same is true for inherited versus non-inherited. You're not a member of that role if it's not inherited and you haven't set role to it. All the same normal stuff, right? But when we do discover that multiple policies have been found for a given query, what we're going to do is actually OR them together, right? The idea here is that maybe you're a member of like 5 different roles. It doesn't make sense that for like the grant system and all of the other systems that we have to just work, right, when you want to query something if you're inherited from all of those, and then have policies mean you have to actually go set role. It doesn't make sense. So you'll actually get the composite set of all of the records that pass any of the policies. Does that help? Yes, Kevin. Did you have a question?
I was just thinking,
Okay.
Since it's default deny, that makes perfect sense.
Right. Yeah, that was the thinking. There was a lot of discussion about this over the summer, to be honest, if people were curious about reading kind of how we came to these decisions. But, all right, so moving on. So, yes?
I'm not sure if this makes any sense at all, but I can't figure out in my mind right now what it does. What about, how does truncate do?
Truncate it doesn't. I mean, if you have the truncate privilege, you're not going to, it's not going to go through this.
So if you've
But
got-
truncate's a separately grantable permission, too.
Right, but I mean, so if you've got row level security on a table, effectively that means no one but a super user or the owner can truncate the table.
No. Other way around. If you have the rights to truncate the table, you're not going to go through the delete policy. No. Nope, it won't go through the delete policy to truncate. It's a good question. But that's a separately, explicitly grantable permission. I don't think it would make sense to turn that into a delete query, which is what you'd have to do. Right. Yeah. Simon's great point is Truncate's there for performance. In large part, it does other nasty things like violate MVCC and all. Visibility rules don't really. It's not great. So it's not something that is considered to be. It doesn't need to go through policy. All right. Moving on. So here's just a very simple example policy creation. So this is going to be typical, right? My user is a column that's in the table, and then current user is a function call, current user, that just returns whatever the current user is. Okay, so you can create this policy on the table, and one of the things I really like about this is the simplicity of it, right? It's just a simple command like this. What I'm going to show is kind of how this can be built up and how it can get a lot more complicated. So here's that same example on the top, and then on the bottom I've shown it's actually equivalent to this command, but this just shows how it kind of builds up and how you can get to be a point where it's very complex. So the top and the bottom are identical here. The bottom is just explicitly specifying with check. Yes?
Just so hypothetically, if you wanted a policy where that limits what you could read, but you're allowed to write anything, you could say with check true.
Absolutely. In fact, one of my examples later has that, just because it's fun. So here's another version of the same thing. This one is just explicitly saying for all, right? Again, it's the exact same policy, but these are the additional little flags and things that you can set in the command definition to change the behavior for specific policies. And last but not least, here's kind of a full definition of a policy, right? So here you have the name, the table, for all, right? So that's for all commands. To public, right? So that means to everyone who's accessing the table. And then we're explicitly setting both the using and the with check clauses. Yes, Bruce?
So, in the beginning you were talking about the fact that this eliminates a lot of the tedium of creating a view for every table.
Mm-hmm.
But it really feels like you're creating a policy for every table.
Yes, you would be. Yeah, so the comment is that, rather than creating views for every table, you have to create policies for every table. That's correct, right? For every table that you want RLS on, you have to create a policy, but you don't have to manage like the permissions, right? The grant system, you don't have to go deal with granting on the view versus granting on the table, right? You don't have to deal with the fact that the view could be owned by somebody differently than the table is, right? I mean, there's a lot of different things you have to deal with that are distinct between the two pieces.
But you're already saying that you're going to have to open up permissions on the table so this actually takes effect.
You would have to open up permissions on the table, but if you have both a view and a table, you could end up with the permissions like on the table ending up granting more access than they should, right? Because people shouldn't generally be able to query through the table directly. You have to always go through the view if you want it to actually work as a security barrier, right? Otherwise, people could just go query the table directly. You have a different set of permissions that have to be managed across the table and the view, right? So there's only one set of permissions for the table. You see what I mean? Those permissions now include the ability to have policies associated with them.
But, well, you're still having to create a policy or a view. You're still having to set the permissions on the table or the view.
No. That's the distinction, right? When you have both the view and the table, you have to set the permissions on both.
No, because the view will give somebody, if you give permissions on the view, they do not have to have permissions on the base.
That's correct, but in terms of a maintenance, you still have to maintain the permissions on both. As things change, as new people get added, roles get, people get removed, roles get.
Just don't touch the regular table and you're.
Oh, but that's not. I mean, idealistically, yes, you're right. You could just never set the permissions on the table, but I don't think. Again, as I was getting to, if the view isn't owned by the same owner as the table, then whoever owns the view is going to have permissions on the table. So maybe you never do that, and that's fair. I get that. But believe me, there's a lot of cases where a view is not going to be ideal.
I'm trying to understand what we're.
Right. This is
What we're eliminating here.
right. Principally, it's around being able to only have to manage that one table object rather than having to manage multiple objects in the system. Yes.
With the example you gave there, at the bottom,
Uh-huh.
does that translate into a key lookup on that particular table if my user is not in a common index?
It will So this is going to get, what's going to happen here is that these clauses are going to be added to the query, and then they'll be added as security barrier calls, just like a security barrier view is, and then the optimizer and planner will go through the normal gyrations to figure out exactly how to run the query. Yes, Joe?
How, if at all, does this interact with things like foreign keys?
So, good question. So when it comes to foreign keys and other referential integrity checks, those are not done through policy, right? Those go, those basically go outside of policy, and so, the reason for that, of course, is that we have to have consistency. We can't allow people to add records that are going to violate a foreign key or violate a primary key. So basically, all of those checks go around that. Yes.
In that case, you could take a brute force approach to finding keys that are in other tables.
That's correct. That's a known case. Absolutely, and documented. Absolutely. It's not uncommon either. I mean, there's other systems that do the same thing. Yeah, it's how. Yeah.
So, using clause, so understanding properly, using clause is generally for the select, complete, and delete. With check is for the new records, right?
Right. With check is only for new records that are being added to the relation.
But I'm not sure because this two both are same, right? It would be confusing for the users because they are especially mentioning using clause. So they are making sure.
Oh, this may not be the best approach, yeah. I mean, in terms of this is just an example to show kind of the overall complexity. If the expressions are the same, then you probably would just use using rather than have two different ones. So that's why, the initial one is, for this particular thing, I would just use that initial statement to, that way it's straightforward for everybody. Make sense? Okay. I'm going to move on a little bit. All right. So I think I've actually ended up covering a lot of this, but for example, select only allows the using clause. When you have insert only allows the with check clause. Right? Update is the one case where you can actually have both, and as Kevin kind of alluded to earlier, we have this capability to have with check equals true, meaning you can insert whatever you want into the table. It's just that you only be able to view through this policy things that are for you, right, for your user. So here's an example for delete, where you have a using, actually, it should have been for delete. Sorry, my bad. That should actually say delete, but it's the same as you only use a using clause for delete. Alter policy is pretty straightforward, right? So you're just altering the definition of the policy. This, of course, can only be done by the table owner or the super user. The only thing that you can't change through an alter policy is the command, right? So you can't change something that's a select into an insert policy through alter policy. It's fine, you just have to do a drop policy and a create policy instead. Everything else is able to be changed. You can rename the policy. You can change the set of roles that the policy applies to. You can change the with or using or with check policies or expressions on the table. Pretty straightforward. Yeah?
This applies for both, but is there a character limit for the expression?
Is there a character limit for the expression? Not that I'm aware of, although I will say that if it gets to a point, I might encourage you to create a function and just call the function inside of the expression instead of actually having a massive thing, just because it'll make things neater. And also when you're looking at the definition of the table, it'll make it a lot simpler. Because we do output the expression, of course, when you do a look at the table, when you query for the definition of the table. Yes?
You mentioned you create a function,
Mm-hmm.
but if the function will query the table itself, right? So if that's the case,
It can. It doesn't have to. It could query something else if it wanted to.
yeah, maybe if it queries the table itself, take the certain rows are not available to the user.
Certain rows are not. Yeah, I mean, the function would have to be a Boolean function that returns true or false for each case, yeah.
If, for example, we have a column like A is, we want to have something A is equal to 1. That's available, but, it's not available.
I'm not sure I'm following. Maybe we'll talk after. Yeah.
If you call a function that queries the same table, will it fire off?
Again, this is going to be added to the overall query and go through regular planning and whatnot. So it probably, depending on what language you write the function in, if it's a SQL function, we might be able to actually inline it potentially. If it's not, then it's going to have to be fired. Of course, because this is a regular expression that's operating against the table, you can pass in columns or whatever you want into the function. All right, so you don't necessarily have to have the function querying the table for the information that's on the row that you're considering whether it's visible or not. You just pass that column into the function, right? As long as the function retains a Boolean, it doesn't matter. Yes, Simon?
So just to check my understanding, what you're saying is if we had a table like, say, patients, and one of the columns was doctor wording, we'd be able to write a using statement that allowed it to run a query using the value doctor wording from that row to determine if that row is visible.
That's correct. Absolutely. That's one of the use cases. Yes, I saw that, Sarah. Can be any expression. I don't care if it's volatile or not. You can. It's not being used for index creation, so it's literally anything. It just has to return a Boolean. Right. Yeah. So the way that I would address that, which I've actually been talking with one of the people on the list about, is you could have a separate table that basically maps sessions to what user or what data element is in the table that you want to be filtering on, and then you can have a subselect that goes and queries that, right? Does that make sense? Yes, Erdman. It's stored the same way we store all of our expressions in the catalog and dumped the same way. So, yeah. Yes.
Just going back to the question about the functions again, does that mean that the functions really ought to be leak-proof? Because what if there's something in the function that leaks information?
That's correct, yeah. So inside of these using clauses, you do have to worry about the potential for it to be leak-proof. We don't require that they be leak-proof, but you're right. If you call a function inside of here and it operates against a row and throws an error, then that returns something to the screen. Yes, that could happen. That's correct. Yes. The expression here is executed as the calling user. Yeah, if you put a security definer function in here, then of course the function will operate as the owner of the function, which I can imagine being a lot of people will probably use that approach. All right, I'm going to have to move on a little bit. So alter policy. Just a couple of examples here of different ways you can change the definition of a policy through alter policy. Again, it's pretty straightforward examples. I'm going to kind of breeze through a couple of these because they're not terribly interesting. Drop policy is, your standard drop policy. You specify the name, and of course you have to provide the table name because policies are distinct on, they apply at the table level, similar to triggers or other things. We do have the if exists. There's no create or replace policy. I don't see that actually being useful. You just use alter policy, but that's something else that could be considered. So how this works against the grant system. So of course, grant is all at the table level and at the column level. It's kind of all or nothing for the rows that are selected, while the policy is at the table level row selection. Right? So that allows you to pull out specific rows. I feel like we probably, through all the questions and whatnot, covered more or less all of this, but just wanted to kind of compare and contrast the two. Again, the grant system kind of comes first, right? So you have to have the ability to run this query. You have to have select rights or insert rights or whatnot on the query or on the table that you're working with. And then it's just then, once you do, and your query has moved on past that, that we go through and add the actual policies onto the query that's being run. Yeah, one of the other kind of key points here is that while the using clause, and I kind of covered this earlier, but I just want to kind of hit on it again. When you have the using clause, right, the using clause is all about filtering, right? It's different from when you have a with check option and you're trying to add records, right? What we'll do if you try to add a record to the table that violates a with check option or a using clause if there's no with check option is it'll actually just throw an error, right? And this is because we don't want to lose data. We don't want to just like filter out those rows you were trying to insert into the table. but it's kind of an interesting distinction that you have to be aware of, right? That'll actually throw an error if you try to insert something that you don't have the permissions to insert through the policy. So here's just an example of what the \d output would look like from this. So here you can see at the bottom when you create policies, you'll have a little policy section. It'll say policy, and then the expression on the policy is for. So it's similar to create policy. Like the defaults aren't going to be explicitly spelled out here. So if you have something that's more complicated, of course, you have like it's for a specific command or it's to a set of specific roles. Those will be added in here as well in the \d output. But they're not there by default when it's just a public role and it's just all for the command that you're using. One other thing just to kind of hit on again. So one point I made earlier is that you have this alter table enable row level security, right? So when you enable that and maybe you only add like an insert policy, because of the default deny policy, no one would be able to see any records that you wanted to, if you wanted to select records out. So I just want to kind of hit on that because even if there's, if you run a command that doesn't have a policy for it, if RLS is enabled, that'll apply, the default deny policy will apply. Yes, Kevin?
Why does it say expression instead of using?
It's a good question. It's a good question. The other one says with check, but you're right. It probably could be using instead of just expression.
Nice when you can copy and paste things like that.
Copy and paste, right. That's a very good point, actually. Okay. I think that's something we can look at changing. I hadn't really considered that, but you're right. Copy and paste would make that nicer. I think this harkens back to when we only had one, and it just didn't get changed for the output. All right, so just this is really straightforward stuff now. You set role to this after having that policy applied, and then you try to select something out, and you only get that R1's data, right? And then here, again, as I said, if you don't specify a with check clause, it'll use the using clause by default. So in this case, if I try to insert data for R2, I'm going to get an error saying, nope, sorry, that violates the policy T1 on the table. Or, sorry, it violates the with check option policy on the table. Doesn't specify the policy name. Yeah?
If you consider enabling the policy as soon as anyone creates any policy on a table?
There was discussion about that. Robert thought that it made more sense because so the question was, what about just turning on ROS automatically when you create a policy? That was how it was done initially. Per the discussion on hackers, which I ended up agreeing with Robert on, is basically the way that would work is that if you did that, you created the policy, and maybe you created like 3 policies, and then you dropped all those policies, you would still have RLS enabled on the table, and it would still have the default deny policy. So, for that to work, we'd have to go through and after you drop all the policies, go disable RLS, which didn't seem like a good idea.
I saw that discussion. I agree with the outcome.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. So again, data modification policies. So with check for adding records. So again, you can use this to create records not visible to the current user if you want. So again, this is that with check true. This is just an example of actually doing it. So here I'm actually inserting in T1 R2. So I'm adding data for that other user. But when I go query it, I'm not actually going to see the results. Make sense? Is everybody familiar with the table command, by the way? I always like to harp on that every time I give a talk because it's awesome. So table is just like select star from, except you don't have to write select star from. You just write table. It's very handy. It's SQL standard too, actually. All right, so this is also something that you can do, right? Again, because it's just an expression that's run, you can actually have a function like check SELinux that then calls out to some external security system, right? That then would go and make a decision about whatever they want. So in this case, I'm passing my data in. Maybe that's some kind of classification or some other identifier that's relevant to the records in this table that I want to go have checked by some external policy system that's been added through create extension, for example. So this is a case where you can actually have it go query out to like the kernel's SELinux system to verify that that user is allowed to see those records. So I think this is something that'll be very interesting to see. That's kind of what I'm planning on working on next is actually flushing that out completely, as a complete solution for something where you actually have row level security integrated with SELinux. So I think it'll be fantastic. All right, so one comment, as Joe mentioned earlier, I wanted to make sure I harped on leak-proof functions. So only leak-proof functions can be pushed down into through these security barrier quals, right? So, or below where the security barrier quals is. The reason this is relevant for performance, right? So you want to be able to have the user specify some kind of conditional to their query that they're writing, and then be able to have that conditional, if it's using a leak-proof function, go down and potentially use like an index or something on the table underneath, because that's going to be a lot more efficient potentially. Now, if the expression itself that we have in the row level or in the policy definition is using something that's distinctive enough inside of the table that it's querying against, it'll be able to use that if it's doing a subselect or something. But generally, you want to be able to have those users specify some conditional that gets pushed down. And that's where it comes to leak-proof functions. So leak-proof functions, however, are very dangerous, right? They must actually be leak-proof. If they're not leak-proof, what can happen is they can leak data, right? Somebody could have a function that's not actually leak-proof that maybe uses like a cast to text, potentially, right? Or a cast to integer, right? And what will happen is that when that cast to integer happens, if it maybe trying to cast a text field, we might return the actual data that was in that text field because we'll say, well, we weren't able to convert this thing to an integer, right? And that's something that can then be leaked, right? That's why those things are not considered leak-proof. Leak-proofs are generally things that are like Boolean operations, which a lot of times is what you want, right? It's either like, equality checks are generally leak-proof, greater than, less than, these things. You can query the system catalogs to see what the set of leak-proof functions are. I used to have the query up here, but it's a little big, but I can certainly help anybody if they have questions about how to go look up which ones are leak-proof. But just be aware of that. I mean, if you see a function that you're calling outside of it that's not getting pushed down, maybe it's because it's not leak-proof, but don't just go make it leak-proof, okay? Leak-proof is something that only a super user can set, and generally, we like to think we got it right. Let's put it that way. So be really, really careful when you're using leak-proof or you're creating or making new things leak-proof. So I want to kind of hit on some of the explain, and just wanted to show what some of these queries look like through explain. So here you can see that, again, this goes back to just a simple policy that I had, my user equal current user. And here you see that there's a filter being applied underneath the sequential scan on this table. So slightly more interesting one is, maybe there's an indexed condition here that's valuable. So this was coming, again, from the policy, but it'll use an index if one's available and the system feels like that's an appropriate thing to do because it's going to be more performant. A slightly more complicated thing is when you're actually going to be providing some kind of a conditional outside, right? In this case, I'm using this regular expression match operator, right? And here you can see that the index condition, my user equal current user, goes down underneath of this subquery in the subquery scan, right? And that's because we've pushed it down into a subquery because we want to make sure that this happens before this thing that came from the user gets applied, right? So that's a very key point. Again, this is how, same way the security barrier views work, is it makes sure that the conditionals in the view, or in this case, the conditionals that apply by the policy, are applied before anything coming from the user, because the user can specify functions or whatever that they want. So I'm about out of time. I do have a couple of minutes for questions. Yes? The function is part of the using expression for the policy, yeah? Yes, yeah, yep, that's correct. If you did actually do a drop cascade, it would work, and it would drop the policy as well, but because we have a default deny policy, that would just reduce what people can see. So you wouldn't end up mistakenly leaking data that way. Other questions? Yes, Bruce?
Do you see any future where we're actually going to place policy information per row in storage?
Where we're going to put, I don't think we're going to now, because now that we have this, you would add the column yourself, essentially, which during a lot of the discussion over the past couple of years about how to implement RLS, there was always this question about, are we going to add this new system column that comes before, and then use that and whatnot, and people liked it, people didn't like it. This avoids that whole question by just having it be an expression. So this is a case where now the user would go and add that column. We don't have to deal with adding that column. You see what I mean? Yeah, so exactly, which is, I think, the best of both worlds.
And that does solve, that is something you really could not do on a view
That's correct. Other questions? Yeah. Grant or revoke privileges for the policies. So, yeah, yes, that is something that I want to add. The ability to grant someone the right to create or drop the policies on a table. Not today. Everything's done as the owner of the table, similar to how the grant system works today. But it's definitely one of the things that I want to look at adding. Maybe 9.6 or 10.0 or whatever. I doubt that it will happen for 9.5, to be honest with you. There's a lot of time left in 9.5, which is great, but at the same time, there's a lot of other stuff going on too, so I don't know that that'll happen. But yes, I totally understand the request.
I have trouble understanding it, but I guess we don't have to get into that.
Understanding the request?
Yeah, well,
So,
not understanding the nature of it.
so what one of the big requirements is, and I'll say this so that everybody and people watching can see, one of the main requirements that I've heard come from a couple of different communities is that the people who create the objects in the system need to be distinct from the people who control the access to the objects in the system. So it's not just that we want the ability to grant away the right to create policies. We want to make that something that only a different set of users can do. Right? And the table owners would then not be allowed to do that. The table owners would only be allowed to construct tables. They wouldn't be able to actually control either the grant system or the policy system. That's something that, yeah, again, this is like 10.0 material, but that's absolutely, yeah, it's absolutely a requirement in a number of different industries. Exactly.
But isn't the owner still the one who can grant permission?
No, not in that situation. In what we're talking about, we would have, basically there'd be some kind of like maybe a role level permission, a role level attribute saying whether your role is allowed to either use grant at all, or use alter policy or create policy at all.
I'm getting the vague outlines.
Okay. Yeah, so that's something that, again, that's far off, but that's definitely, one of the things that we're looking at doing next because it's absolutely important. Yes, Sarah? No, we do not have the ability to have default policies yet. That's another great thing that I would like to add, but not today. So similar to how we have default permissions, you can alter default and create default privileges. Yeah, that's something I definitely would like to add, but it's not there today. It'd be a little bit tricky, similar to how default privileges are, though, because for default privileges, does it support column level stuff? Because how do you know if the column's even going to exist in the table? You'd probably need that for default policies because you're going to have to reference the column somehow. Still, it's a great question, and it'd be really neat if we could do. Other questions? No? All right, well, I'm about out of time. Thank you very much.